Toshiro Umezawa is a classic OG Kamigawa legend, and when you put him in the command zone, you get to play a really unique mono-black Spellslinger control deck. But what if you could add a second color to his color identity? Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. I am Eric, and we like to build unconventional commander decks on this channel. So today we're talking about Toshiro Umezawa, all the way back from Betrayers of Kamigawa. Toshiro is a legendary human samurai that costs 1 black. He has Bushido 1, which we don't even care about, so I'm not going to describe it. More importantly, Toshiro has, whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, you may cast target instant card from your graveyard. If that spell would be put into a graveyard this turn, exile it instead. So Toshiro is a Spellslinger value engine, letting you recast instants from your graveyard whenever your opponent's creatures die, whether you kill them yourself or they just die by any other means. Now, Toshiro Umezawa decks typically play a lot of instant speed kill spells, instant speed card draw, and even instant speed single-use ramp, like Dark Ritual. And those decks can multiply the value they get from all of these instants by reusing them with Toshiro's ability. So naturally, if we could add more colors to Toshiro Umezawa's color identity, we'll gain access to even more instant speed spells that can fill roles unavailable in mono black, like better card draw or more mana ramp or more versatile removal. So we're going to add green to Toshiro's color identity by taking him out of the command zone and replacing him with my good buddy, Old Stickfingers. Now, Old Stickfingers costs X and black-green, its power and toughness are equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard, and it has, whenever you cast this spell, reveal X cards from the top of your library until you reveal X creature cards, put all creature cards revealed this way into your graveyard, and put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So Old Stickfingers is interesting because its on-cast trigger will specifically pull X creature cards of your deck. That means when you cast Old Stickfingers, if X is greater than or equal to the number of creature cards in your deck, you're basically tutoring very specific creature cards into your graveyard. So if Old Stickfingers is your commander and your deck runs a small number of creatures, you can easily guarantee access to those creatures just by casting Old Stickfingers. Well, at least those creatures will be put into your graveyard. You'll still typically need to get them back out of your graveyard if you want to use them. Now, there are lots of possibilities when building Old Stickfingers as a way to tutor specific creatures into your graveyard. In fact, I previously detailed 50 such possibilities, and you can see that video here, or check out the link in the description. So with this deck, we're going to use Old Stickfingers to pull Toshiro Umezawa out of our library and put him into our graveyard. We'll use reanimation effects to take Toshiro Umezawa back out of the graveyard and put it into our hand, or directly into play. And then we'll take advantage of these instant speed, green, ramp, and removal and other support cards, as well as the black ones that we would normally get in a Toshiro deck, that we can cast from our graveyard using Toshiro's ability. But Toshiro Umezawa is not the only creature in this deck. There are a few others that support this Spellslinger control strategy. Let's go over the contents of this deck, starting with the creatures. Now, if we want Old Stickfingers to reliably tutor specific creatures into our graveyard, like Toshiro Umezawa, then we'll need to make sure that our deck isn't running very many creatures. I've chosen to include 7 creatures in this deck, one of which of course is Toshiro Umezawa. Now, casting Old Stickfingers with X equals 7 to pull all of those creatures out of our deck and into the graveyard is asking a lot, and that'll cost you 9 mana. But I also like, number 1, having a bit of randomness in my gameplay, and number 2, having some redundancy. And after all, this deck is heavily reliant on its graveyard, so graveyard hate from our opponents can absolutely ruin our day, and having a few redundant creatures in the deck will give us some extra resilience. So, long story short, I don't typically cast Old Stickfingers with such a large X value as to pull all of the creatures out of my deck. So maybe when I cast it finds Toshiro, and maybe it doesn't. But either way, we're going to get something valuable. Like Sedgemoor Witch or Witherbloom Apprentice. These creatures both have Magecraft, so they'll get a triggered ability whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell. And with 41 instants in this deck, because Toshiro loves instants, these guys will trigger a lot. Of course, they'll also trigger when we cast those instants from our graveyard with Toshiro's ability as well. A Sedgemoor Witch makes a pest token whenever you copy or cast an instant or sorcery spell. That pest token is a 1/1 creature that has, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life. Now those pest tokens make great blockers, which we kind of want since we have so few creatures in this deck, and they also help, bump up your life total a little bit when they die. Now Witherbloom Apprentice has each opponent lose 1 life and you gain 1 life whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell. This also protects your life total, but it can slowly drain your opponents to death as well. Now as long as we want our opponent's creatures to die for Toshiro, we need to make sure that they always have creatures. Grismold the Dreadsower is an excellent way to do this. This is a 3-mana 3/3 with Trample, and it has at the beginning of your end step, each player creates a 1/1 green plant creature token. And whenever a creature token dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on Grismold. Now in my playtesting, Grismold has been amazing in this deck. It's a potential finisher since it can get really big, and it's got Trample. It gives our opponents creatures for us to kill for Toshiro. It gives us blockers, so Grismold is really good, maybe even better than Toshiro sometimes. Now as long as Toshiro wants our opponent's creatures to die, we'll also use Morbid Opportunist. This guy has, whenever 1 or more creatures die, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. Despite that once per turn limit, this is still really great card draw. It triggers when any creature dies, even token creatures, even creatures your opponents control, and there just aren't many creatures that do this. Grim Haruspex, for example, makes you draw a card when a creature dies, and this isn't just limited to once per turn, but it is limited to only non-token creatures dying, and only creatures you control dying, and we don't need that in this deck. We need card draw when our opponent's creatures die. And we really like that Morbid Opportunist triggers when creature tokens die as well, since Grismold and Sedgemoor Witch make tokens for us. Now of course if you're looking for a specific creature and Old Stickfingers doesn't find it for you, you can just go find it yourself if you have Gravebreaker Lamia. This is a 4/4 with lifelink that costs 4 and black, and it has when Gravebreaker Lamia enters the battlefield, search your library for a card, put it into your graveyard, then shuffle. Also spells you cast from your graveyard cost 1 less to cast. Now Gravebreaker Lamia is also really great in this deck. First, again, it can find a specific creature in your deck if you haven't found it with Old Stickfingers yet, and put that creature into your graveyard, where all of your recursion, which we'll talk about later, can recover it. But you don't have to find a creature with Gravebreaker Lamia. You can find any card, like an instant spell that you can then cast from your graveyard with Toshiro's trigger, whenever an opponent's creature dies. You can even find some key non-creature, non-instant spells, because some of our recursion can recover any type of card from our graveyard thanks to our access to green, which has excellent graveyard recursion. Finally, of course, Gravebreaker Lamia's second ability gives us a 1-mana discount on all of our spells that we cast from our graveyard using Toshiro's ability. So again, this is a really awesome card here. And then our final creature in this deck is Rift Sweeper. And this is a 2-mana 2/2, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose target face-up exiled card, its owner shuffles it into their library. Now Rift Sweeper is our insurance. If any of our key creatures get exiled, Rift Sweeper is one of very few cards in all of Magic that can get those cards back. Now that card will be put into our library, which is somewhat inconvenient, but Old Stickfingers can get it back out of our library for us, at least if it's a creature. In my opinion, Rift Sweeper is absolutely vital for this type of Old Stickfingers deck that's playing around with a hidden commander like Toshiro Umezawa, a hidden commander that's not in the command zone. So without Rift Sweeper, a single Swords to Plowshares or something would end our game plan immediately. So those are our creatures. Again, we don't want many of them so that we can be relatively likely to find specific ones when we cast Old Stickfingers. But we still need to get those creatures back out of our graveyard after Old Stickfingers puts them there. Let's talk about how we're going to do that. Now, Toshiro Umezawa lets us cast instant spells from our graveyard when our opponent's creatures die. So we want as many of our ramp, draw, and removal effects to be instants, and the same is true for our graveyard recursion spells. A Footbottom Feast and Bone Harvest are great mass recursion spells at instant speed. They let you put any number of creature cards from your graveyard on top of your library, then draw a card. so you'll at least get one of those creatures into your hand right now. Death Denied also lets you return X creature cards from your graveyard to your hand, for a cost of X and 2 black. Malakir Rebirth isn't quite recursion, but it does protect a creature that we've already got onto the battlefield, and again, we can recast it with Toshiro, which is awesome. Or it's a land if we don't need the spell. Now, Wretched Confluence is expensive at 5 mana, but it lets us recur up to 3 creatures to our hand from our graveyard, or draw up to 3 cards, or kill small creatures, or any combination of these effects. Agadeem's Awakening isn't an instant, but it lets you recur multiple creature cards from your graveyard directly to the battlefield, or it's a land if you need it. But now what's really exciting about our recursion is that unlike a normal Toshiro deck, we now have access to green. Black is already great at recurring creatures from our graveyard, but having green in the deck lets us recur other cards too. Noxious Revival and Reclaim are both instants that let you put any single card you want from your graveyard on top of your library. Bala Ged Recovery isn't an instant, but it's still great recursion for any card, or it's a land if you need it. Now I also like Dryad's Revival. Again, it's not an instant, but it's really valuable here. It's a sorcery that lets you return any target card from your graveyard to your hand, but it's also got Flashback for 4 and a green. Now Flashback is really great here. With something like our Gravebreaker Lamia, that lets us find any card in our deck and put it into our graveyard. I'll often just use Gravebreaker Lamia to find Dryad's Revival and then cast it for its flashback cost to get whatever I want from my graveyard back to my hand. And this can be really useful if you've got a specific card in your graveyard that you want to reuse, but maybe you don't have another way to return it from your graveyard to your hand at the moment. So Dryad's Revival is really versatile here, if a little expensive to use. Now I also like You Happen on a Glade. This one is an instant, it costs 2 and a green, and you can either search your library for 2 basic lands to your hand. This is great to make sure you hit your land drops, or you can return any target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. Now, Evolution Charm is also really versatile. It's a 2-mana instant, and you can search your library for a basic land, put it into your hand, or return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand, or give a creature flying until end of turn. And finally, we've got a couple of permanents that'll give us repeatable graveyard recursion. Palace Siege is a budget reanimator staple, letting you return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand at the beginning of each of your upkeeps. And Journey to Eternity is awesome in a Golgari graveyard deck. When it transforms into Atzel, Cave of Eternity, you can pay 3 black, green, and tap it to return target creature card from your graveyard directly to the battlefield. So these are all of the ways that we'll have access to recover our creatures from the graveyard, whether they were put there by Old Stickfingers or whether they just happened to die normally. And now let's talk about some of our other supporting cards and our win conditions. Okay, so Primal Amulet is really awesome in this deck. This is a 4-mana artifact that makes all of your instants and sorceries cost 1 less to cast, and when you cast one, it gets a charge counter, and then if it has 4 or more charge counters, you may transform it into Primal Wellspring. Now this land taps for 1 mana of any color, and when you use that mana to cast an instant or sorcery spell, you copy that spell, and you may choose new targets for the copy. This card is nuts. First, again, we have lots of instants in this deck, and even some sorceries. And Primal Wellspring even lets us copy the ones that we cast from our graveyard with Toshiro's trigger, because they're still being cast, and we're still spending mana to cast them. We'll also use Mimic Bat. As long as we're killing our opponent's creatures, this will let us make token copies of whatever we kill, which is pretty great. So I also want to specifically mention Golgari Charm here. Now, this is an instant that costs black-green, and you've got 3 modes. You can either give all creatures -1/-1 until end of turn, and this mode is actually really awesome. And it's why I wanted to mention this card here in the win conditions. Because remember, we're using Grismold the Dreadsower. And this guy gets a +1/+1 counter whenever a creature token dies. With Grismold and Sedgemoor Witch just filling up the board with 1/1 tokens, Golgari Charm can wipe out all of those tokens at once, giving a massive power boost to Grismold and just maybe letting it one-shot an opponent out of nowhere. And not to mention getting a ton of Toshiro triggers. Now, Golgari Charm can also destroy a target enchantment or regenerate each creature you control, so it's great board wipe protection. Now, because we'll have access to green, we'll also use Veil of Summer. This is a great way to protect our win conditions. This is an instant spell that costs a single green. You draw a card if an opponent has cast a blue or black spell this turn, so you can basically cycle it if you need to. but it also has spells you control can't be countered this turn, and you and permanents you control gain hexproof from blue and black until end of turn. Veil of Summer is an awesome anti-control piece, especially against blue counterspells in any deck. But remember, we can also cast this from the graveyard with Toshiro as long as we kill a creature first. So this is a really good way to shut down your opponent's answers. But what are the win conditions that we're trying to protect? Well, we already mentioned a possible combat win with Grismold, but also like any good black control deck, we'll also play Torment of Hailfire, which by the way is a great spell to copy with a transformed Primal Amulet. As long as we're killing our opponent's creatures, we'll also use Revel in Riches. And then finally we've got Chain of Smog. This is a 2-mana sorcery that has target player discard 2 cards. That player may copy the spell, and they may choose a new target for that copy. Now the combo here is that with Chain of Smog, you can target yourself. You'll discard 2 cards, but then you can choose to copy the spell. And you can do this as many times as you want. You'll have no cards left in hand, but that's okay if your opponents are dead. And when you copy the spell an arbitrarily large number of times, you can kill your opponents with Witherbloom Apprentice, which again has each opponent lose 1 life and you gain 1 life whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell. We'll also include Professor Onyx for redundancy. This 6-mana 5 loyalty Liliana Planeswalker has a static Madecraft ability that has each opponent lose 2 life and you gain 2 life whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell. So again, infinite combo with Chain of Smog. Professor Onyx also has a +1 that gives you some card advantage and fills your graveyard, which is fine in this deck. It has a -3 that has each opponent sacrifice their biggest creature, so again, more creature removal and more Toshiro triggers. And it has a -8 that you'll probably never get to use, but it's sort of a mini Torment of Hailfire. And those are our win conditions. Again, this is a Spellslinger control deck, so we're going to take our time and control the board, and so having only a few win conditions is fine in a deck like this. So that's our main strategy, but let's talk about some of the supporting cards that make the deck work, starting with the removal. Now Toshiro wants our opponent's creatures to die, and we have very few creatures in this deck, so we're kind of defenseless. So we'll use a lot of removal spells, and as many of them as possible are instants, so Toshiro can reuse them. Cling to Dust and Erebos' Intervention can help us deal with opponents abusing their graveyards, or Erebos' Intervention can just kill a creature instead. Cling to Dust can also be cast repeatedly from our graveyard for its escape cost, though realistically we won't pay that cost too many times since most of our cards in our graveyard can be reused in some way, so we don't really want to exile most of them. Tragic Slip, Go for the Throat, and Infernal Grasp are all really efficient single target creature removal, which is great for triggering Toshiro, or casting from our graveyard from a Toshiro trigger because of their low mana cost. Now I also like sacrifice effects to get around Hexproof or Indestructible. Liliana's Triumph, Soul Shatter, and Vona's Hunger all make each player sacrifice a creature, so we'll typically get 3 Toshiro triggers off of any of these spells in a 4-player game. Now Soul Shatter specifically makes our opponent sacrifice their biggest creature, and Vona's Hunger makes them sacrifice half their creatures instead of just 1, if we have the City's Blessing. And then there's Snuff Out, which we can cast for free by paying 4 life, if we control a swamp, and it destroys a target non-black creature. Now again, having access to green gives us plenty of additional removal spells that are unavailable in a mono-black deck that you would typically see, for Toshiro normally. Nature's Claim, Return to Nature, and Naturalize are all cheap instants that can hit artifacts or enchantments, and again we can cast them from our graveyard with Toshiro. There's Abrupt Decay, Assassin's Trophy, Beast Within, and these can kill just about anything, and again they're instant so we can reuse them with Toshiro. Windgrace's Judgment is expensive at 5 mana, but it lets you destroy 1 non-land permanent that each opponent controls. And it's another instant. Again, Toshiro lets us reuse it. This one can be absolutely brutal when you can cast it twice. Death Sprout kills a creature and ramps us. And yes, again, it's an instant. And finally, we do need some board wipes. Fortunately, Golgari has a few options for us, and though sadly none of them are instants. Pernicious Deed lets us destroy artifacts, creatures, and enchantments, and Gaze of Granite destroys all non-land permanents. Now both of these destroy permanents based on their mana value, so you're paying some X cost in destroying the permanents with mana value X or less. But most of our permanents are not expensive, so most of the time we're just going to use these 2 spells to wipe out everything, including your own stuff. So again, we've got lots of removal, and almost all of it is at instant speed, which is great both for Toshiro and for letting us play as reactively as possible. Now let's talk about our mana ramp, our card draw, and some of our lands. Now, just like everything else, we want as much of our ramp and card draw to be instants so that Toshiro can reuse them. Skeletal Scrying, Blood Pact, and Succumb to Temptation are all classic black card draw instants that make us lose a little bit of life in exchange for card draw. A Skeletal Scrying also requires that we exile some cards from our graveyard, which again, there's a lot of cards we won't want to exile since we have lots of recursion, but there's usually at least a few things we don't mind exiling. Crushing Disappointment, Dark Bargain, and Moonlight Bargain are more of the same, exchanging life for cards. Dark Bargain will also put a card in our graveyard, which again, we don't mind because we're probably going to be able to recur it. Now, Moonlight Bargain lets us look at the top 5 cards of our library, and then for each one you'll get to either choose to pay 2 life to put it into your hand, or otherwise it will go to your graveyard. And again, with all of our graveyard recursion and our ability to cast instants from our graveyard with Toshiro, Moonlight Bargain is a win-win, whether the card goes to our hand or to our graveyard. And then we'll use Death Reap Ritual, which is amazing card draw in this deck. It's a 4-mana enchantment, and it has at the beginning of each end step, if a creature died this turn, you may draw a card. Now with all of our removal, this is great card advantage, and you'll often get 2 to 3 cards for each rotation of the table. Now when it comes to mana ramp, if you were playing a typical mono black Toshiro deck, you wouldn't have access to much instant speed mana ramp to abuse with Toshiro's ability. You're mostly limited to Cabal Ritual and Dark Ritual. And these are great ritual effects, and we will use them here too. But since we've added green, we'll have access to some instant speed permanent ramp that we can recast from our graveyard with Toshiro's triggered ability. Now first, Farseek, Nature's Lore, and Rampant Growth, these aren't instants, but they are very efficient 2-mana green ramp. Harrow and Roiling Regrowth are instants. As an additional cost to cast them, you sacrifice a land, and then you get to search your library for 2 basic lands, put them onto the battlefield. Crop Rotation lets you sacrifice a land to search any land out of your library and put it onto the battlefield. Now this isn't ramp, but it does let you find things like Cabal Coffers or Urborg, or if you've got Toshiro out and a creature dies, then you can cast Crop Rotation again and go get both. Now, speaking of lands, we've already mentioned some of the really awesome Zendikar Rising MDFC lands, like Malakir Rebirth, Hagra Mauling, Agadeem's Awakening. Some of these are also instants, so Toshiro lets us recast them. Of course, we'll also use Bojuka Bog for some graveyard hate. Otherwise, we've got dual lands that we can find with Nature's Lore or Farseek, like Woodland Chasm or Overgrown Tomb. Then we've got things like Command Tower, Darkbore Pathway, Deathcap Glade. These are going to help us with mana fixing, as well as Fabled Passage, Llanowar Wastes, Tainted Wood, and Temple of Mystery, which is more of the same, green or black mana fixing. And the rest of our mana base is made up of basics, 10 forests and 9 swamps. So that's the deck. Now before we talk a bit about how this deck plays, let's go over the deck stats and cost. This Golgari Toshiro Umezawa deck has an average mana value of a nice, brisk 2.67. Cheap instants are integral to making Toshiro work, since you'll often need to be able to afford to cast both a kill spell and another instant from your graveyard back to back to get value from Toshiro's trigger, so having cheap, affordable spells is crucial. We have 7 creatures in this deck, not counting the commander. Again, I chose this number for a balance between reliability and redundancy, or, between being reasonably certain, but not often guaranteed, to find a specific creature by casting Old Stickfingers, while also having some backups in case one of my key creatures gets exiled or something. Now Toshiro cares about instants, and we've got a massive 41 of them in this deck, compared to just 29 in the average Toshiro deck on EDHREC. Now I think adding green is what really helps us here, since we can use instants for ramp and removal more easily than we'd be able to in a mono black deck. Now we also have 14 pieces of graveyard recursion. Again, mono black is already great at recurring creatures, but because we also have green in this deck, we can also recover non-creature cards from our graveyard pretty effectively too. Now despite the deck's low average mana value, this deck can be mana hungry, especially when we're trying to use Toshiro's triggered ability. And furthermore, we want to be able to ramp and cast Old Stickfingers as soon as possible, so we've got 13 sources of ramp in this deck. And we've also got 9 sources of card draw. Finally, we have a healthy 19 pieces of single target removal, and every single one of them is an instant. And we also have 2 board wipes. At the time of this recording, this deck has a value of $275.44 on tcgplayer.com. Now, I didn't make a budget version of this deck, since the deck is already a bit janky, and I just wanted it to be able to perform well. And I felt that decreasing the deck's budget would really make some of the deck's weaknesses become a little too apparent. Despite that, $275 is a pretty good price and is sadly considered fairly affordable for even a casual commander deck where, $500+ decks are fairly common. So that's Golgari Toshiro Umezawa. Now this was a pretty cool Spellslinger control deck to play with. You'll often play a draw-goes strategy, which is super weird in a non-blue deck, and you'll have plenty of answers to deal with threats, both creature and non-creature. Now this is pretty normal for Toshiro Umezawa, well, with the exception of dealing with non-creature threats. Though admittedly, Toshiro Umezawa is not a normal commander at all. But compared to a typical mono-black Toshiro Umezawa deck, having access to green really improves our ability to ramp and to answer non-creature threats, and even to recur cards from our graveyard, again due to green's excellent ability to recur any type of card from the graveyard. But we also get access to a couple of win conditions that a mono-black Toshiro deck doesn't have. Griswold the Dreadsower, again, is definitely a potential win condition, on top of just giving us some defenses against combat damage with all of those tokens. But Witherbloom Apprentice is also redundancy for Professor Onyx in the Chain of Smog combo. And Witherbloom Apprentice can be tutored out of our deck with Old Stickfingers, though I guess there's no shortage of mono black tutors either. Now there are a couple of things you'll need to be aware of when playing this deck. First, we are jumping through some hoops to get access to Toshiro, or our other creatures. We need to cast our commander first, and unless you cast Old Stickfingers for at least 9 mana, that is with X equals 7, you're not guaranteed to find Toshiro. And then you'll need other spells to recur Toshiro from your graveyard, so this deck can be a little slower than a typical Toshiro deck. Secondly, even though we have Rift Sweeper to give us some protection against exile effects, we are still very vulnerable to graveyard hate. And not only do we need access to our graveyard to even get Toshiro into play with Old Stickfingers, but we also need access to our graveyard to use Toshiro's ability to generate value, and cast those instants from our graveyard. I played a game against Anafenza the Foremost, and she was pretty much kill on sight for me. Unfortunately, with all of the removal in this deck, that's not a problem. That said, there is plenty of other graveyard hate within all of Magic that is harder for us to interact with, and can absolutely make our game plan a lot harder to execute. That said, our win conditions aren't strictly dependent on our graveyard, and we do have a lot of removal to protect ourselves and let us play a longer game, so we can possibly wait to find those win conditions naturally if our opponents prevent us from safely tutoring them into our graveyard. And another positive note, if we do have access to our graveyard, then with all of our graveyard recursion, you won't worry about commander decks like you would in a normal Toshiro deck, since Old Stickfingers is really only here to help us put a few select creatures into our graveyard, and once you've done that, your commander is usually unnecessary for the rest of the game. So that's the deck. If you enjoy Mono Black Toshiro Umezawa, and you wouldn't mind a slightly jankier version, this deck was a lot of fun. But that's all I've got for today. Let me know your thoughts on this one in the comments, or let me know if there's any other commanders or strategies that you'd like to see turned into a commander deck, especially an unconventional one. But thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.